a slow reading exercise. And this is what I propose in this series of videos, so that this will be both a reading group and something more than that. Some sort of a slow reading or in-depth reading of the classical works of literature. For this video, I've chosen to first paragraphs from the other side of the Cat and Racket story, or novella, rather, by Honoré de Balzac. Honoré de Balzac is actually a classical French writer from the early 19th century, and in my view, his works can be taken for very close, very slow reading, because they have a lot of richness in them. There is very thick texture. There is also a sense of the classical literature that they convey from the French, from the early modern French period, I would say, and it is. And these works come from the time before the emergence of a lot of things. Um, in other words, they present a very outdated world, a very out there reality, such as in Paris and France. And essentially, the story starts with a particular place in Paris, Rue Saint-Denis, near the street Saint-Denis, and the street Petit-Lion, basically Saint Denis and small line streets. And then we have somebody. Once again, I'm not sure if this is about whether Honoré de Balzac was actually taking the perspective of the main character, the hero of the story, or he's actually outside observing both the place, that corner in Paris, in I imagine an imaginary past, or let's say a reimagined past in Paris. I think that one should also realize that at the time of the writing, for the author Honoré de Balzac, that period in the history of France or Paris, one may choose between of these, was already history, so that he was having, let's say, several decades um, distance between the time essentially of the French Restoration and I guess the time immediately after the French Revolution, and immediately after the turbulent period in the history of France at the time. And then we have, there is a very romantic or nostalgic point of view on Paris, because he speaks about delightful houses. He speaks about historians' perspective on these, and also how brittle the history of old Paris was in physical terms, as I guess it was started to be modernized. We should only think about the Ottoman period, when a lot of the old architecture of Paris was actually destroyed. And already, I believe, before that, Honoré de Balzac actually offers a sort of a very careful, very cherishing point of view on Paris, on that period. And basically he marvels at the very superficial aspect of those very older houses, or say very peculiar architecture, or he really pays attention to what one can see if one ventured. And I'm still not sure if this is something of recreation, if whether Honoré de Balzac actually like imagines the time, or he already or he writes from what were the remnants of those early periods at his time writing. There is a lot of things that that one might think of as actually fascinating. And of course, one should not forget the, let's say, Netflix series, Emily in Paris, etc., etc. In other words, even though it is a very plot-driven series, but it still showcases Paris. It still showcases something of a great brand in culture terms. And I think that Honoré de Balzac is one of the creators of that brand, all the way back to, let's say, centuries earlier. As a writer who was doing that at the time when there was no TV and no series on the internet, and so that literature was actually one of the main sources of entertainment, other than maybe theater, other than maybe opera or classical music as well. So that we should probably remember that at the time literature was a very serious business, also economically. We should not forget that. So that and essentially Honoré de Balzac thinks about the fragility, or let's say the quirkiness of some of the some of the architecture we could see in Paris. And assume it could be actually wooden. Some of the houses would be wooden or whatever. If he was speaking about the shaking of the house, whatever, let's say there would be a carriage passing by, and assume that in the Western house it wouldn't be the case. And then of course, Honoré de Balzac speaks about the climate of Paris, so that there is a sense of placing Paris in its own location as a trait, as a very characterizing trait for the whole thing. In other words, I think it seems that um, for this point of view to be brought to bear on this narrative, it seems to be a sense of a very objective lens, a very scholarly or scientific. It seems that climate or geography knowledge was one of the ways that one could maybe elevate the diction with respect to Paris. And then we should also not forget that the region is in French, so that I'm going through an English translation of the work, and I think that one should not forget first the differences in between English and French as languages. And then even when one does a translation into English, there is an inevitable impact of the original on the, let's say, from the original text on the translation, which still makes effort to match either the music of the original text or the metaphors, the flow ideas. Essentially, when one actually translates, then one does lose a lot of the music of the original words, which are not there. But one is still obliged to maintain the structure of the sentences, however long they are, or the content of them, even if it is in another language. And it seems that a lot of that is happening in this case, even though I imagine that there will be newer translations. In other words, already with one of the translations which are already in the public access, in the public domain, so that it is not inevitable that there would be more modern versions of the same text in English, and assume that a lot of the diction, a lot of the underlying um, uh, substrate, underlying infrastructure of the English spoken language would be changing from one period to another. I can only think about the translation of the work by Musil, which would be about the man without qualities. That is the title of the work, and the author is actually, of course, Robert Musil. And I've been seeing the translation into English from German in the 50s. and it would be very stilted English prose, very formal, very non-flexible, very outdated, and then a translation done in the 1990s would be far more flowing, far more alive, especially given that one would have had already in the 60s a revolution in the North America because a lot of the globalization thing happening to English language and in the English language. And I think that in this respect, translations from let's say French from the classical French into English would be maybe more of a provincial affair, less let's say less how shall I put it less important maybe, since I think that Robert Musil and the German language have some of the well important or let's say cachet culturally, even though Honoré de Balzac is also as one of the classics of the French literature is very important in that literature, but I think that I'm not sure that he is really read or reread in the public sphere, or there is much of awareness of classical literature in the English. It's a common. mm, no, I'm sure how to call that because maybe I'm actually missing the point. Maybe let's say French classical literature has a lot of international attention, etc., etc., and I'm sure it does. But my personal impression is that English culture is very much about English authors, such as maybe Dickens, such as maybe let's say mm, maybe James Joyce, and maybe other giants of the English literature. In theatre, English language theatre comes off, let's say, time again back to Shakespeare, etc., etc., or maybe to the translations of let's say, more celebrated European contemporary and classical authors. And this is that even, let's say, in the German cultures, not necessarily in the English speaking world, there is a lot of attention to what is being written in one's own language, so that French works in translation are kind of maybe art at a certain disadvantage in that respect. And I think that there is an extra value in actually in doing a closer reading of the works, and it seems that one is, let's say, straight reading of the text is not something that has a lot of added value, but I think that picking on those items, picking on what makes a text, and actually going on tangents can be something of a of a project like undertaking, especially in the video form. I believe. Precisely because a lot of the classical literature would have that encyclopedic precision to it. Authors of the rank of Honoré de Balzac would actually make a lot of effort to be very precise, very learned in their references, such as Doma window. This is one of the architectural references one sees, and then one has to know more or less well what that is, and maybe it was something specific to the period of the French history and the architecture that that building was replaced, and then it will be a remove yet because it will be maybe like a perspective or even a perspective when one would think about that building in the storyline would be already an old one, so that in whatever prehistory, and that means that it was built originally maybe let's say 30 years ago, or maybe before the time of the storytelling all the time in the narrative, in the fictional narrative, and it will be like something of the effort by the narrative to maybe ride over out of the revolutionary period, which would be like the recent history at that time. And I think this is what makes I think that this type of text is mm, very fascinating in its own right, as we try to pick apart, okay, what makes the different elements of the text in terms of what actually are the layers of the perspective, what are the elements of how it also builds that scene, and we kind of have a young man standing on the street on a March day, basically springtime in Paris, which is probably I think that um, some of the conventions of I guess series one season Netflix and literature which sold well, and I believe at the time in France would still be very similar. How to build a narrative. You pick a young, precious, perceptive man, place him in a corner of some sort of side street in Paris, and here you are. You've got the main use of a romantic story, I believe, and this young man looks at that very old house, a shop house essentially, and he makes essentially Honoré de Balzac makes us, let's say, look into the train of thought, into the train of the observation that young man is described to have as a third person hero of the story, and we have him enthused. In other words, he has that vibe, that appreciation for the history. He understands, he sees and understands where that architecture comes from. He sees those elements in the whole building. He is a very keen observer, basically, and we are basically and we are basically left to know that, led to understand that that building has a lot of time inscribed into it, so that peers of the 19th century would have seen as architecture stemming from the 16th century, essentially 200 years prior to that, as something having that weight of time already making those buildings remarkable, those survivors of the previous ages remarkable in the eyes of the contemporary observer, anything that almost so right now, let's say in the present moment, in the 21st century. And then of course we've got that kind of forensic analysis of the building, how it is built, what is making that building singular. Singularity may mean something different right now, no, but at the time it was about a particularity, and I think that once again we're dealing with an English translation, maybe well, the translation coming from either late 19th century or the early 20th century. So that this is something of a of the effort by the contemporary translator in English to convey that interest, to convey that sense of the let's say, even were a movie, it would be opening shots of a series, opening shots of a high production movie. Essentially, if you think about Hollywood productions, or if you think about any major series, let's say The Queen or whatever, or The Crown, where we have a lot of the funds being spent on actually recreating the authentic feel, the authentic mise en scène of a particular period. And I think this is, and that would be something pertaining to the production values of the movie or of a series, of an or of an episode. And it seems that for the novel to actually give that sense of the high production values, it would have to be very well constructed as a description, as a snapshot, so that we would be having kind of an imaginary crew, an imaginary photographer doing all of that work, and then somebody doing well a meticulous write-up of what is in the scene, obviously what actually has to be in the scene, and I think that this is what is going on in a one-man show of the writer, of the genius writer, who was probably writing and rewriting those opening paragraphs of the story, which would be like a meticulous, slow theater of the opening paragraph, where we essentially see that young man peering into the house, into the shop house through the Venetian blinds, kind of sees, let's say, these blinds drawn up in part, and then he sees some of the interior decor, the curtains, and then glass panes, and then once again at that time glass was probably also something special. And it would be made in some places, so, or rather, it was not industrialized. It was not an industrial period, so that maybe a good quality glass would be coming from a certain region in Europe, Bohemia, so that somewhere in the contemporary Czech Republic, I believe. So that, and at the time it would be maybe part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it was, but still a lot of the trading goods will be flowing relatively freely, especially between centers of economic activity such as Paris and maybe outlying parts of Europe at the time, so that one should not forget another place of Paris, well, as a capital city at the time as a very important economically, politically, etc., and it would actually command high quality materials being brought into the capital for probably ever and ever. In other words, and it seems that there is that sense that once again, Balzac mentions the Museum of Arts and Crafts, and it seems that it will be a very modern invention by any imaginables. In my understanding, and I could be wrong, the Museum of Arts and Crafts was probably founded in Paris after the French Revolution, so that there is that sense of the narrative in the literary field drawn upon some of the very new institutions at the time, and already making an observation that one needs to preserve, to document everyday life in Paris as it was still available, and as it could be not available over time due to other destructions or fires or whatever that might be, so that that French carpentry, that art of the carpentry needed to be preserved, and this is some of the offhand remarks in the novel, in the story or novella, and it seems that once again the there is that kind of zoom in the story, and yeah, the author zooms in into the field of perception. Once again, one might think of the phenomenology, and I think that one wouldn't probably have that whole field of the philosophy in France and Germany were it not for the works of literature, which were maybe first that would be, let's say, trying to innovate formally or whatever, where the narrative zooms into the window glazing to describe the structure of that, such as small squares of glass. of the green color, so that it will be something of a structural element in the mise-en-scène of how the narrative unfolds. And that what one sees if one comes really close to the window pane, and the character, the young man in the story, actually sees a blue-checked cotton curtains, and it is it is something of a perceptual revelation, something that once again in the flow of the narrative it may be like a very small detail, but here in this like really slow reading of the whole thing, this makes part of the mystique of the whole thing, of the how shall I put it, of why this piece of literature, why this piece of writing, since this is one of the stories in, I think, a very famous cycle, the, the, the human comedy by Honoré de Balzac, and this is one of the opening, let's say, grand concertos, grand openings. In other words, if you think about, let's say, the opening bars of an opera work, the opening sounds of a large-scale musical piece. And it is something that one should not forget also, that of course for the contemporary French reader, Balzac's French is already outdated, as probably this type of English translation is probably quite dated for the contemporary English sensibility. But then still this pattern of time in the narrative itself, I think that it is attractive and also historically fraught in its own right, so that reading a work in translation into a version of English in a particular point of time has its own, I think, added value, as we kind of see the author or the hero of the novel think about the fruitlessness of the contemplation, and there is that sense of the very intense use, or let's say disinterested gaze of the narrator that we see ascribed to the young hero of the novel. And then we have that extra dimension of actually being in the place, so that it is a very quiet street, a quiet period, and the young man registers the silence, so that we have that sense of kind of interplay in between the perspective of the narrator, which is who is essentially invisible. He is that, let's say, he is both in the fourth wall of the scene. He is probably sitting with us and telling us what is going on in that scene out there. We're kind of we are relying on his senses, so that he is actually recording. He is recording the scene, the mise-en-scène, the time, place, also the geography of the neighborhood. We're going to know that it is a house, an old house in a sort of a sloping street. There is a sense of the lower parts of the city. There is a sense of the very romantic, very dense, and very, I would say, very cinematic sense of that point of view, and that we have that kind of reaction of the that smile passes over the face of the young hero of the narrative, as he sort of observes those quirky, those small items, and he registers those. He kind of notices their peculiarity. He notices how different they are, how special they are, and I think that with him, we experience more or less the same. There is this sense of the train of the invitation inspiration to be identified with that protagonist of the novel via the craft of the writer that essentially Honoré de Balzac employs.